Welcome to Module 8. In this module we'll be looking at input variables and also a new kind of loop. So we'll be using dynamic input to determine the results that we will return, and also what you'll learn here as far as a new loop step is how to loop through multiple pages. Alright, so I'm going to review what we want to do here, what our robot is going to accomplish. We will be creating a new complex type that is going to be used then as an input variable. We'll be building a new robot, and then we will create that input variable from the type we created earlier. We'll be entering text as a variable value, looping through lines and then looping through pages. We'll also get a chance to look at branches. We'll be extracting values, but we'll reuse the snippet we've already created. You get a chance also to learn about something called a try step. And we're even going to create a generate error step that will allow us to generate an error without the robot crashing, and that error gets logged and it'll be logged with whatever language we want to use. And we'll be, of course, testing, debugging, returning values, and so forth. So, what we want to do first of all right, this is our Hardy Hardware homepage again. This time what we're going to do, though, is interact with it. And we want to enter in a search term. In this case, it's pegboard. And what would an operator do? Well, they'd press the enter key, right? And we'd return a list of items. And we want to extract the details from that list, even if it's on multiple pages. And if there's no match found, instead of crashing the robot, we want to have it exit gracefully but log an error for us in the words that we want to use. All right, so that's what we want to do here. How as a human being do you accomplish that? Well, the first thing you do is you go to the Hardy Hardware website homepage, right? So we'll have a load page step. Go into the same URL that we've used in the past. And then what we're going to do is set up an enter text step for our search item here. So we go over and we enter a term in. And for that, we're going to use an input variable. And then what would an operator do? They'd press the enter key to execute the search. And a new page or a series of pages comes up with the items that we want, and we perform our extraction steps. But we're going to want to loop through multiple items, and because there will often be multiple pages, we want to loop through those pages as well. All right? So the way we're going to accomplish this, in this case it's pegboard we're searching for, is through something called an input variable. Okay, now without reading all of the text here, you can do that on your own. When you create a variable, there's a small checkbox that will allow you to specify it as input. And if it's input, then an operator can actually enter in a value, or you're going to do it here in Design Studio, or provide a default value that will be used as input. Okay. Now, one reminder here, and this is addressed in the second bullet item, is that in order to use a variable for input or output, remember it has to be created from a type. You cannot use a simple variable for input or output. So we will create our type first, and then from our type we will create a variable, and we're going to mark it as input. So taking a look at this, you see that we have created a new type called input.type. You see it over here on the left side in my projects panel. And what I've opened up that new type I've created, and I'm adding, in this case, just one attribute, and I called it search for. Okay, I made it short text. I'm not going to provide a value here. We will when we get to our variable in just a minute, but I will mark this as required, because this is what this whole robot is going to be based on, is an input value. Okay, so it's marked required but not part of my database key. So I only have the one attribute. All right, and then what I'm going to do is create a new robot, and this one I called search item dot robot. And remember that we discussed this earlier, that we're going to use the default browser engine, and also we'll be using minimal execution here. All right, so we'll create a new robot. Then what we're going to do in this new robot is we will add variables. Now one of these is going to be Hardy hardware, okay, because we will be doing extraction. So you use the little plus button you see down here at the bottom of the screen, and we've added Hardy hardware, and actually that will come over automatically later on. If I forget to add it here, okay, it will come over when we add our snippet. Okay, but we are creating a variable here called input. Okay, and that variable will actually be used as input. You see the little checkbox. Now, whether you mark it global or not here doesn't really affect it at all. It doesn't need to be marked global. But notice here also that it's required, so it gets the little red dot. And we have the opportunity here to provide a default value, which is great for testing. So I have a value already there. In this case, I've typed in pegboard, and all the future steps are going to be based on that input variable. Okay, so you'll see how we use this in just a couple minutes. But the important thing here is we created this new variable called input. We're going to be using the input type. Okay, if you remember, that's created from our type, and we'll use it as an input variable. All right, and then we're going to start building our robot. And beyond the URL, okay, the first thing we do is we are going to click on that little search box and create what's called an entered text step. So, and I'll demo this for you in just a little bit, but I'm going to left mouse click on search, which puts a little green box around it. It's selected. And then I right mouse click, and this time I'm not doing any clicking. You see click is available here, but I'm going to select enter text. Okay, now when I do that, I get a series of tabs on a dialog box, and excuse me, on my action step panel, there are a series of tabs. We don't bring up a dialog box. This is simply the enter text properties. Okay, so over in the step properties here on the basic tab, I have this enter search for. Okay, you can call it whatever you want. On the Finders tab, there's nothing we do here. We actually found this just fine, but I'm just showing it to you. So this uses a finder to identify the area on the page where the search box is. Okay, on the third tab here, labeled Action, this maps the value entered to the input variable we set up. Okay, so text to enter is input.search for. Now I know that's a little tough to read here. It's tough even with my glasses for me to read it. So what that is what are we populating this box with? And we're populating it with the value from our input variable, which is called input, and then .search for the attribute. So that's what's going to be populating this text, and it's available here from a drop down. Now look closely, guys. I want to show you something because people miss this quite often, and again, I apologize, it's rather small on this screenshot, but if you notice, there are actually two drop down arrows here within this blue box on the slide. The first one on the right side, the smaller arrow, allows you to specify things like a text constant or a variable or an expression. Those are available, and what I have selected here from that drop down is I want to populate this text box with the value from a variable. So I selected variable, and then the larger two of the drop down arrows will allow me to select the variable I want to populate this with, which is my input.search for. Okay, and then the fourth tab here, error handling, we just left alone. All right, now we've entered the text, and as you pass the step, you will see this in your browser. The next thing an operator would do is they press the enter key to execute the search, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to do a press key action step, and I can just do a right mouse click on my end step and say insert a step before, or I can take the enter search for step and right mouse click and say enter a step after, and then it'll be a blank step, and I just select the action from the action drop down that I want to do a press key step, and then in its properties on the action tab, what do I want it to press? I want it to press enter. Okay, again, I'm going to demo all of this for you so you see it in context. Okay, so as you pass to the end step now, that search is executed, and what you will see is a list of items based on the search term that was entered as your default. Now, in this particular example, I didn't search on pegboards. Instead, I searched on pipes. That actually returned, if you look down at the bottom, 3 pages of results. So there's a lot of stuff having to do with pipes here. Okay, so just to review where we are so far, we have entered the URL in our load page step. We have entered text into our search term and pressed a key called enter, and then we bring this page up. So what we want to do now is begin looping through these items and bringing up the details on each of them. And you can see here that the text in orange on each of these is actually a hyperlink that points to the URL for each of these individual items, and that'll bring up the details if you click on them. So I'm going to want to set up a loop that loops through each of these, brings up the item, follow it with an extract step, but then I've got a new challenge, and that is that there are multiple pages. And so what I am going to do is look, how do I get to the next page as a human being? I click on the next button. That's one way, and that's the easiest way here because there is a next button. In a later lab, we'll deal with a web page that's not so conveniently laid out and doesn't have the next button. It has numbers instead, and we'll look at how to handle that as well. But all right, so we're going to want to loop through the multiple pages. So we're actually going to have a loop embedded in a loop. Okay, so this step should be fairly easy for you. All I've done is taken my first item here on the page that was returned, and I right mouse click on it and I say loop. And in this case, because each one of these points to a URL, I said loop for you each URL. Okay, and I can test my loop again. Remember, always when you create a loop, test it and make sure that the blue box that's created now actually advances once each time you advance the forward button on your loop. Make sure it works. Okay, so that'll execute the loop. Now what do we need to do? We're looping through while we still haven't clicked on the item yet to bring up the details, so we need a click step. So again, with the same item selected, I'm going to right mouse click and select click. Okay, maybe change the name to click item because it'll have a name specific to that first item if I don't do that. And of course, all the way, I would be reviewing, by the way, my HTML tags and cleaning them up if it's possible to do that, right? And then we'll add our extraction snippet. So the click step brings up the details. We already have a snippet to do the extraction. We'll simply add that snippet after our click item step, and that should return the values. Now I can test this at this point, and I should see all of the values for my page, everything that's on this single page, returned down below. I can run this in debug mode, right? But it's going to stop after one page. We haven't accommodated for additional pages yet. So we're going to also, so for testing purposes, we'll add a return value step here just before our end step, and that'll actually allow us to see the results in debug mode. And I want to point out something here in debug mode too, is you do have the opportunity to change the default, actually overwrite the default input variable value. So in this example, if we started with pegboards, here I've typed in pipes, okay, or I might type in hammers or whatever it happens to be, and I can rerun this robot in debug mode and see the results. So that's kind of handy. Okay, now just a little word of caution here. In order to be able to change the value, the robot must have run through to completion. If you stop the robot, and there's a little stop button up on the top bar here, if you stop it, you need to make sure that you also click the reset button to reset everything back to the beginning in order to change your input variable here. But that's interactive. You can type in whatever value you want. Okay. Now, looping through pages, something new. Okay. So what I am going to do, and I'm going to show you how to do this, and then I'll have a little discussion on what it's doing and the order of events here, is I actually want to insert my, it's called a repeat next loop, and I want to insert that before the for each URLs loop that I currently have. Okay, again, bear with me just a minute or two and I'll kind of discuss the order here. So this is, I'm going to do an insert action step before the for each URL step that I have selected here. And this will add a new action step. Right now it's unnamed, no action selected. So I'm selecting it now, and I'll go to the action tab for that unnamed step, and I will select loop, and then from the flyout menu, repeat. And that'll add the first part of what's called a repeat next loop. Okay, so this actually comes before the other loop step. I've inserted it in between here. Okay, now what we're going to do is add a branch. Repeat loops always are paired with what's called a next loop. Okay, they're paired together, and the whole thing together is called a repeat next loop. And for this to work, we actually need to create a branch, and I'm going to do that right now. So with with the repeat loop selected, there is a button on the toolbar that will create a branch immediately after the step selected. It branches down from it. Okay, so by clicking on that button, I get a branch down now that shows up like this. There's nothing on it other than another end step, but that's it. Okay, so what I want to do now is put the steps that happen after we have run all of the looping steps on the for each URL step. What's going to happen is that the robot then bounces back here, goes down to, whoops, the next branch. And I'll go ahead, since I advanced the slide, and show you here. It'll bounce down here to the next branch and execute what's ever there. And when it hits a step called next, it comes back up here and increments the repeat step by 1 and then re-executes everything beyond it. So once we get everything set up, I think it's going to make more sense to you. So one thing that I want to do is set the error handling properties for my for each URL step. So with that selected, excuse me, let me stop right there. I will do that in just a minute, but actually I have the end step selected down here. So what we want to have happen with this end step is we want to break the loop at that point. So in other words, when we bounce back down here, everything just stops. We stop looping altogether. Okay, and again, when all of this is put together, it's going to make more sense. So just bear with me a few more minutes, okay? Now, all right, what I'm going to do is go down to the second end step and decide what I want to have happen when this first loop, we're down here 20 items or whatever fits on a page. So there's nothing else to extract. We go down here to the dot and then down onto the next branch. So the first thing is I want the what would you do as an operator? You'd click the next button, wouldn't you? Okay. So I'm going to set up a click step here, and I do that as before, you know, an action step, and I can say click a click step, or you can click on the button. Either one of those will work. And then I'm going to add what's called a next step. Okay, and this is available from the loop menu. So here, let me describe, because I think it'll make more sense now that this whole thing is set up, what we're doing. So, okay, first of all, the page is loaded. And then from that input variable, the text gets entered, the search term, and the enter key is pressed right here. Okay, that brings up our first page of items that match that term. Now initially we're on iteration 1 of this repeat loop, so we pass right past it, past the little dot, and start executing here. We're on the first part of the for each URL loop. And so that's the very first item on the first page. We simply click on the hyperlink that takes us to the detail page, run our extraction snippet, return the value, hit the end step, bounce back here to item number 2. So this item of the for each URL is going to advance by 1. And then we click and extract return value item 3, item 4, and so forth. And let's pretend there's 20 items on a page. So when this hits 20, there are no more items, are there? And what it's going to do then is go back to this point, which is kind of a stop point here, and go down to the next branch, which clicks on next. Okay, I'll explain this little no symbol at the top in just a moment. This clicks on next, and then it selects the next part of the repeat next loop, which sends this back up here. This goes to iteration number 2, and now the second page is already displayed. It repeats the loop another 20 or so times, then it hits the end, goes back down here, clicks on next to bring up page 3, hits the next part of the loop. This goes to iteration 3, and so forth until it's done. Now what happens when there is no more next button because you're on the last page? Well, that's what this little no symbol is. Remember, we set up the error handling to break the loop, and that's what will happen here is the loop gets broken and things end. Okay, so that's what's going to happen here. Now what happens though if there is no matching term? Well, right now what would happen is you would get an error on this for each URL step that says no tag was found. Can't find anything. And the robot basically crashes. So what I want to do is make that a little more graceful, and if a search term is entered for which there's no match, I want the robot just to return, log an error message that says that there was no matching value, and exit the robot gracefully. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that next. This is just a quick review of repeat and next loops. I've already talked about that, so I'm not going to read this slide to you. You can review it on your own. Now we can test this so far in debug mode, right? And you know, as long as it's a valid search term with matches, the robot should run successfully. And you'll see it actually looping through multiple items on multiple pages. You can watch the execution flow. And if you're successful so far, make sure you remember to save things, because we're going to add now this error stuff. So what happens if an item is not found? Well, right now what would happen is you'd throw an API exception, and it gets a little nasty, and basically the robot just, it stops, it crashes. Okay, so I want to handle that with a little more grace, if you will. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the for each URL step. So this is where we actually, based on that search term, we're going to the page. Now, if there's nothing to return, there is no URL that's matched. I want to do something other than just throwing an API exception here. So what I'm going to do is use something called a try step. It's kind of similar to a branch point because it might have one or several branches going out from it. It differs from a branch point because beyond the first one, they're executed only if a step on the preceding branch activates the error handling option. Yeah, that'll make sense in a second. So I'm going to add a step before, and this time instead of an action step or a snippet step, I'm going to select a try step. Okay, and that is a little diamond shape icon, and it will automatically, by the way, create a branch step for you that leads down from it. So what I'm going to do is change the error handling now for the for each URL step. So if there is no match, rather than throwing an API exception, I want it just to bounce over to the try step and do something down here on this lower branch. Okay, so the way that I do that is I go to the error handling of the for each URL loop step, error handling, and I unchecked API exception, I unchecked log as error, and instead for what I wanted to do from the drop down, I simply said try next alternative at the nearest try step. And that puts this little blue arrow icon here to indicate that what will happen here is if this step is not successful, we simply go back to this try step and then go down here, to the next branch and execute the steps on that branch. So what we want to do here is on the alternative branch, which has its own end step again, is I want to add a step that generates an error that we log, but it doesn't throw an exception. It just logs the error. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do, and what I've done is I created a new action step just before the end step on this branch, and for the action I went down and selected other and then generate error. Okay, and that gets a special symbol. It's a little hexagon. And if I go to its properties, what I can do here is specify the error message I want to generate. So I have complete control, and I typed in no matching items found. That's what I want logged. And I'm going to tell it to go ahead and log this as an error, but then ignore and continue. So it's going to continue to what? The end step. Now, just to make our robot a little bit neater, what I've done here then is I grabbed that end step and I dragged it up to the other end step so that instead of having all these multiple endpoints, at least in this case, I take it right back to the original one. So if there's no matching item, we simply log the error and we stop the robot. We end it right there, but no API exception is thrown. All right, so we can test it, we can save it. Run it in debug mode. Later on, you're going to be uploading this to Management Console and running it there. We'll even create a caplet from it, interactive for the end user, right? So we'll be doing all of that in future modules. Right now, I want to demonstrate setting this up for you. So hopefully, if things were a little fuzzy here or unclear because I threw a lot at you at once, seeing it in context and seeing me set it up from scratch, I think it's going to make more sense. So go ahead and close down the PowerPoint presentation and go ahead and open up your demonstration for Module 8. I'll see you there.